Hi, welcome to chapter 14. We're finally here. This is the last chapter, and we've saved the juiciest topic to end on, destructive leadership, which is often referred to as toxic leadership, and there are other terms. Part of studying destructive leadership involves acknowledging the dark side of human nature. Just as leadership can be a positive force in an organization or group, it can also be a destructive force. And we're also going to look beyond just the culpability of destructive leaders to see how situations and followers can also contribute to destructive leadership. So for the purposes of illustration, let's use some destructive leaders that you know through literature or books as examples. And I would urge you to think of someone in particular, whether it's a fictional character or someone in your life, to represent the destructive leader here, and kind of apply these concepts to that person. Having a specific individual in mind can make these abstract concepts more concrete. Plus, you get to really think about the text, and you'll remember them better if you're linking them to something you're familiar with. Here they are, the final set of study guide questions. So it's not surprising that they start by asking you to define destructive leadership and to identify its defining characteristics. I also want you to be able to understand the toxic triangle and its components. So what characteristics or causes are associated with destructive leaders? So this is covered both in the book and in the lecture, but some of the rest are lecture only. What psychological factors of followers foster destructive leadership? What are the two types of followers susceptible to destructive leadership, and how can they be subdivided? What environmental factors foster destructive leadership? And what are the strategies to combat destructive leadership from the three perspectives? So recognize that we're going to look beyond the culpability of destructive leaders themselves to see how the situations and followers can contribute to destructive leadership. So that's that full picture that we're developing. So, as we usually do, let's start with the textbook definition. Destructive leadership is the process whereby an individual exercises excessive control and coercion to force a group of individuals to accomplish the leader's own goals without regard to the impact on others or the organization. There are a couple of things worth unpacking here. Destructive leadership is about how leaders use power to force people, often against their will, to do things that the leader alone wants done. It's destructive because it abuses followers and damages the organization. As you can tell from the wording, there are some areas that are subjective. When does control and coercion become excessive control and coercion? And if you've coerced people, if they've drunk the Kool-Aid and they've bought into what the leader is telling them, are they really forcing the group to do something? So just FYI, if you don't remember the term drunk the Kool-Aid, that's from an earlier lecture this semester, and it refers to a destructive leader, Jim Jones, and the mass suicide at Jonestown in Guyana in the 1970s. So take a look that up, and you will have an idea about how bad it can get with destructive leadership. So how can we tell when someone's a destructive leader? Let's start by looking at their characteristics. So let's think about Darth Vader as the example. So first, they have that hallmark, excessive use of power, control, or influence. They're often authoritarian in leadership style, and they rely on coercive power. So you can probably think about the movies and easily see that about Darth Vader. Definitely a Theory X kind of leader, somebody who doesn't sit around chatting with followers, deciding the best way to do something. Instead, Darth Vader gave orders, and he tortured or killed or held somebody up in the air. Anyone who stood up to them or someone who failed to follow through on the orders. This leader is very dogmatic. It's my way or the highway. Literally, only his way is the way to go. Any deviance from his wishes means torture or death. This leadership also has a selfish quality. It's not focused on the good of the entire group. It's focused on what benefits him, what he wants to achieve. So when we're looking at, what Darth Vader wants, in the end, he's kind of salvaged or saved because he seems to value, his son. But in so many other ways, this is somebody who has his own idea about what he wants to achieve, his own role. And although he follows his master, he's he doesn't care what anyone else who stands in his way wants. So the focus here is only on the leader's goals and objectives instead of the common goals of leaders and followers or organizational goals. Planets, people get wiped out because that is what is going to achieve the goals. This kind of leadership builds resentment in followers, obviously, if your planet's being wiped out or you're going to prison or encased in carbonite. And it hinders others from feeling empowered and autonomous. So think about how Darth Vader treats even loyal followers, even people who are trying to do the right thing. Their power derives from their proximity to Darth Vader, but they can't act on their own sometimes without fear of punishment. Or if they do act on their own and they mess it up, they are going to be punished. So selfishness is a problem because selfish individuals are more likely to seek powerful positions and, strangely enough, more likely to be identified as leaders by others. Isn't that weird? So they are extroverts who are seen as energetic and charismatic. Once in power, impulsive leaders are free to satisfy their own desires at the expense of others. So that is actually based on research. So what is it? Extroverts, energetic, charismatic, sometimes impulsive, who satisfy their desires at the expense of others. For example, a destructive leader might unfairly consume organizational resources. So that person might rack up a restaurant bill and charge it to the company. Or they might violate group norms or company policies, like in sexual harassment. Does that sound like anyone who's been in the news lately? In the final case study, the book discusses Jeffrey Weinstein, the fallout from whose toxic leadership still is not completely over. And he's a poster boy for this sort of violation of company policies, not to mention laws and fundamental decency. Destructive leaders justify these actions by defining morality in terms of rights instead of responsibilities. So they might say something like, I earned this fancy dinner as a leader or high contributor to the organization. So organizations actually can reinforce this selfishness by not challenging these behaviors. So if they occur and the organization doesn't challenge them, they let them go, it reinforces them. Destructive leadership involves harmful behaviors. So to return to our Darth Vader example, we can have, the planet killer that is being constructed. And that is kind of seen as a good end. So those leaders can force followers to behave in ways that have detrimental outcomes. So think of how, we can have people who turn in others to the bad guys, right? They're so afraid of consequences that they will turn on each other. So they might turn on family. They might do things that are horrific. And finally, of course, this kind of leadership can end up violating the organization's legitimate interests by sabotaging the organization's goals and the well-being or satisfaction of followers. So we can have leaders who maybe rise to power on people who feel dispossessed, who feel like their status is threatened, who see this person as giving them what they need. Maybe they dislike some things that are happening now, or they have less money or less power. And so they think about the good old days. When if you're going to look at Voldemort, you have the powers of all those old wizards, the wizarding families who liked the good old days when everybody knew their place and they were the ones in power. And those followers became the Death Eaters. So they initially gained status and prestige and money, but, they lost power when Voldemort fell. So you can see how so many of these fictional leaders in many ways mimic and maybe are drawn from some of our own history of these destructive, toxic leaders, why they rise to power, why people align with them, and then what happens after they fall. So I've continued to talk about destructive leadership in terms of Darth Vader, and I brought in Voldemort from the Harry Potter books. So Star Wars and Harry Potter. But as the textbook discusses, a toxic leader alone is generally not the only component of destructive leadership. To explain what fosters destructive leadership, Padilla, Hogan, and Kaiser, three researchers, created a model called the toxic triangle that outlines the key components that make destructive leadership possible. As we've talked about all semester, leadership is about more than just the leader. To understand destructive leadership, it's important to look at the two other variables: susceptible followers and conducive environments. And this is what we call the toxic triangle. This is like the perfect storm of what makes destructive leadership. We want to avoid destructive leadership because it has a negative impact on followers' attitudes towards their job in the organization. Destructive leadership increases occupational stress in followers as well. So even the ones who support the destructive leader are more stressed. Let's look at each of these elements one by one. So we'll start by considering the traits of destructive leaders. First up, charisma. Remember chapter 2, where we talked about the 6 key traits of leaders? So charisma is one of them, the one that is the hardest to learn. So we've learned that this is a special quality or charm that enhances the leader's ability to gain devotion. When used destructively, leaders win over others to exploit them. So we're going to look at Harry Potter. Let's think about Tom Riddle. That's Voldemort's earliest incarnation and how that guy is described. So he wins over everyone. He's charismatic and persuasive, and people want to like him. That's common with destructive leaders. Padilla and the other researchers who defined the toxic triangle in 2007 explain charisma in this way. Not all charismatic leaders are destructive, but most destructive leaders are charismatic. Charismatic leaders can get people to follow a vision, have a lot of energy, and are excellent self-presenters in terms of managing their self-image and how they speak. Ethics is the distinguishing quality for constructive and destructive charismatic leaders. Ethical charismatic leaders use their position of power to service others. Unethical charismatic leaders use power to gain more power and to self-promote. Destructive leaders also have an intense need for power. With this need for power, leaders exhibit control and coercion in various ways. Coupled with this need for power is narcissism. You've probably read a lot of that about that if you've read any sort of anything on the internet during the past few years. You've probably seen it in regard to dating or your parents. Is my mom a narcissist? Am I dating a narcissist? How to spot a narcissist in 10 minutes. So let's look at this one a little more closely. Narcissists think highly of themselves, and they like leadership roles because it gets them more attention. Narcissists have good social skills, and they make a positive first impression because they come across as bold and competent. So if you're going to look at first impressions, the dark side is pretty compelling. There is a boldness to it. There is a confidence to it. There's a lack of waffling. If you think about Harry Potter, think about Tom Riddle in his Hogwarts days. He was a prefect and a model student in many ways. So there's, that narcissism is attractive. And narcissists like the power and attention that comes with that role. However, while they can look good on the surface, narcissists exhibit multiple poor leadership behaviors. They ignore others' viewpoints. They seek special privileges. They demand obedience and admiration. They dismiss negative feedback. They lack empathy. And they put their organizations at risk because they have unrealistic visions and expectations of what they and their groups can achieve. So, just to recap, here are the traits we've already talked about. Let's finish off this list of traits of destructive leadership with the final 2 traits. Frequently, destructive leaders have negative or traumatic childhood experiences or negative life stories. So let's think about Darth Vader. He was Anakin Skywalker, and Anakin Skywalker was essentially the child of a single mother, no father in the picture, and a slave. Think of Tom Riddle from Harry Potter, who became Voldemort. Think about his childhood. He grew up impoverished in a family filled with mental illness and how that affected him. Researchers have found that destructive leaders talk about negative life stories or troubled pasts. These often stem back to childhood experiences, and they serve to shape their views of the world. Destructive leaders disassociate from painful experiences and ignore feelings, which leads them to ignore followers' feelings and viewpoints and to exploit others. These negative experiences can also be linked to an individual's ideology of hate. This is when the leader's rhetoric, vision, and worldview contain images of hate. So there's a lot of talk about killing enemies. So if you look at our history, obviously you can find this when you listen to or read, speeches from Hitler or Stalin. If you're looking at fiction, well, if we go to Darth Vader, we have that quote from Emperor Palpatine, Darth Vader's master, who said, "Let the hate flow through you." It's kind of the whole point of the dark side, right? You are driven by hate. You let that hatred loose. And of course, if you're looking at Harry Potter, you have all that mudbloods rhetoric. So the negative childhood experience that toxic leader will tend to talk about does have a link to this ideology as perhaps a reaction to a formation in which self-hatred then is turned outward. This is similar to the idea we talked about earlier in the semester, the locus of control. If someone has an external locus of control, they tend to have a victim mentality. So other people are to blame for their own problems. But usually, those same people who have that external locus of control claim full responsibility for any of their successes. So it's not somebody else who created their success, just their failures. Those who have an internal locus of control take responsibility for both their successes and their failures. So when you were a child and you admitted that you made a mistake and that you were going to do better, and you were probably praised for this, that's because your parents wanted you to develop that internal locus of control, that sense that you were responsible for your own destiny, that you could control it, you could make both good and bad decisions, and that was part of who you are as an individual. They didn't want you to have that victim mentality. So what happens when people have that external locus of control? Well, that's taking your self-hatred and then seeking to blame someone else. That often results in scapegoating, like the Jews that were scapegoated in the 1930s and 40s and millennia before that, or the way that some people now tend to blame immigrants or particular groups of immigrants for taking all the jobs as an explanation for why they themselves are unemployed. According to Padilla and these other researchers, hateful themes also emerge in the world of business, and they cite an article in the Wall Street Journal that described how senior managers at Enron created a culture of intimidation. In fact, the CFO, Andrew Fastow, had a cube on his desk with the inscription, "When Enron says it's going to rip your face off, it means it will rip your face off," with an exclamation point. Now let's turn to the second component of the toxic triangle, susceptible followers. Voldemort would be nowhere without his army of Death Eaters, right? Darth Vader had all those stormtroopers. So these susceptible followers come in two flavors, conformers and colluders. Conformers conform because they lack a clearly defined self-concept, and they fear what will happen if they don't follow. They are essentially characterized by unmet basic needs, negative self-evaluations, and immaturity. They engage in bad behavior because they are conforming to leaders and are prone to obedience, so they wouldn't misbehave on their own. We'll talk more about those in a minute. Colluders are followers who comply in the hopes of getting something out of it for themselves. Basically, they're ambitious and selfish. They actively support and contribute to the leader's actions. So we have lots of colluders in the Star Wars universe who are in fact aligned with the dark side. They're aligned with the Empire. And then we have, if we're looking at the world of Harry Potter, we have the Malfoys and the Lestranges of the organization. The conformers can be further broken down into three types. So let's take the first two to begin with. Lost souls and authoritarians. Lost souls are needy individuals. They're vulnerable to destructive leaders because they have unmet needs, like a need for recognition or love. They are experiencing personal life distress, like divorce or failing school. They lack a sense of identity or self-concept. They have low self-esteem. Or they comply because they admire and identify with the leader. So these people are particularly attracted to charismatic leaders because those leaders increase self-esteem through approval, they offer belonging, and they provide direction. So these followers are attracted to referent power. You might say they're the wormtails of the Harry Potter world. The second type are authoritarians, and they have rigid hierarchical attitudes. They have an unconditional respect for authority, they believe in a just world, and they reject uncertainty. This leads to compliance because they believe the leader has a right to be obeyed, because that person is the leader. These followers are attracted to legitimate power, so they like when somebody has the title. These are the ones who back Voldemort because they're members of the old wizarding family. Think about the British aristocracy that would back the king or queen no matter what. In the Harry Potter world, Lord Voldemort is a continuation and upholding of that rule, that system, as opposed to upstart Muggleborns who are achieving positions in the wizarding world through merit rather than by birth. If you think about the Empire, there are people in that universe who support the Empire because it's the current power, right? They know how to work within that power structure. So you will always have authoritarians. Conformers are bystanders. This is the most common type of bad follower. These people are passive and they're motivated by fear. They're characterized by negative self-evaluations, so they feel like they cannot resist the leader. They must submit and they feel like victims. They're good at self-monitoring, reading the situation, and remaining passive to avoid punishment. They lack a courageous pro-social disposition, meaning they're likely not to act if it will negatively impact them, so they're not going to take risks like whistleblowing or raising concerns. They differ from other conformers because bystanders have more negative opinions of the leaders privately, but they still publicly do their bidding. These people are often led by coercive power and comply because they're afraid of punishment. It's almost like they view the leader's orders as threats. If a leader doesn't seem to have much coercive power, the bystander is less likely to follow them. So think about the people on a planet who see that wave of stormtroopers approaching and immediately give up. Or most of the wizards during the height of Voldemort's power. So these are the ones who immediately look at the threat and then comply. When I think of the conformers, I think of a line from W.B. Yeats' The Second Coming, which was written after World War I. And it's a great source to seek out. It's not very long, and it's eerily prescient. So here's what he said. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So bystanders are the former, the followers who lack all conviction. So that's the best among them. And the worst are those authoritarians with their passionate intensity. So you see how it's prescient for those pre-World War II times, but it can apply today too. Now, let's look more closely at the colluders. While the conformist followers are somewhat more passive and seem to have some redeeming characteristics, the two types of colluders are much more active, and thus more complicit in the toxic actions of the leader. Colluders comply in the hope of getting something out of it for themselves. Basically, they're ambitious and selfish, and they actively support and contribute to the leader's actions. Like the conformists, they can be broken down into different types. The first type are opportunists, and they're looking to gain from following the leader or performing these bad actions. They're characterized by personal ambition, so they might be looking to get ahead and they're willing to push legal limits to do so, greed, and lack of self-control. They're motivated by reward power, and they carry out the leader's orders because they think they're going to get something they want in exchange, like money, status, or power. So think about all the royal families that just rolled over for the empire, all the politicians who gave them what they wanted, the leaders. Think about the Malfoys and the other wizards who benefited from the Dark Lord's reign in Harry Potter. The other type are acolytes. Rather than being loyal based on rewards or personal gain, acolytes are true believers, and they share the same values as the leader. So in the Star Wars universe, these are the Sith. Or in Harry Potter, think about Bellatrix Lestrange. These individuals have a firm sense of self. So unlike the lost souls, they have a self-concept. They're highly internally motivated to engage in toxic behavior if they think it will help achieve the leader's goals. So they are going to do the worst. They are going to kill innocents. They are going to be like in Harry Potter, Bellatrix Lestrange, who uses the unforgivable curses. They're motivated by the expert power of the leader. They truly believe the leader is competent and knowledgeable enough to meet their goals. Finally, we come to the third part of the toxic triangle, conducive environments. Essentially, for a destructive leader to rise to power, the perfect storm of ingredients needs to be available. One of those is, of course, the followers, but some of the other elements include instability. In times of crisis and confusion, there's a need for the restoration of stability as quickly as possible. This means it's easier for a destructive leader to assert power, as it is easier to assert more power when rules and systemic structures are not clearly established. In these unstable situations, it's also easier to make unilateral decisions. Acting unilaterally, the leader can make radical changes. These decisions create more confusion. So think about what happens when there is a war. And all the typical structures in a society are destroyed or don't function the way they normally would. That's when you get a rise in power from a lot of new actors, right? And they can make decisions that might not be democratic. So they can make authoritarian decisions at that point. If we're looking at these power vacuums, we could see what happens in Harry Potter after Dumbledore dies. So in that case, Dolores Umbridge becomes the headmistress of Hogwarts. And then after she grabs that power, she makes a lot of different rules that allow her to quash opposition. Perceived threats. People naturally want to be protected from threats that can occur on many levels, including physically, socially, or financially. Threats do not need to be real. They only need to be perceived to be real. So let's look at the Harry Potter world, the boggarts. These are magical creatures that can appear threatening, but if you laugh at them, then they dissipate. When we're fearful of being injured or hurt in some way, it is human to want to be taken care of by a strong leader. So we're more willing to give up our agency, our ability to act independently. Moral values. Broadly speaking, certain general values in society can increase the likelihood of destructive leadership. So, avoidance of uncertainty. So there are some societies, like Japan, that rely on established social norms, rituals, and procedures to avoid uncertainty. Collectivism. A society which is collectivist, like North Korea, identifies with and emphasizes broader societal interests rather than the individual goals and accomplishments. High power distance. Countries or societies with this attribute, like Saudi Arabia, mean that the people accept the fact that power can be distributed unequally. And the absence of checks, balances, and institutionalization. So what is the principle of checks and balances? This refers to the way power and influence are shared in an organizational system. There's an opportunity for power abuse in the absence of checks and balances. For example, think of the President of the United States. He can't just make any laws he wants. They have to go through Congress as well. They have the ability to check his power. And finally, institutionalization. This is a process concerned with making rules and regulations in an organization. Like checks and balances, institutionalization is a way for individuals and groups to explain how influence and power is shared within the organization. Strong institutionalization lessens the potential for destructive leadership. So, how can we combat destructive leadership? Well, much like the toxic triangle, there are three perspectives on how to address the issue: the leader, the followers, and the context. Taken collectively, these perspectives provide a strong basis for developing strategies to combat destructive leadership. First, leaders. Getting rid of destructive leaders is hard because they possess charisma, power, narcissistic leanings, and psychological needs. Think about how hard it was to get rid of Voldemort, or how difficult it is to get rid of Darth Vader. So it takes a long time and a lot of effort. Perhaps the best solution is to not let one arise in the first place. Organizations can develop effective procedures to identify potentially destructive leaders. Many companies require that potential employees take a battery of psychological tests to identify their strengths and weaknesses and whether they're a good match for the job and the organization's culture. Followers. Once a destructive leader is in place, In situations where there are communication or legal channels available for individuals to express their concerns, it is incumbent upon people to speak out, confront the leader, and demand change. Be a whistleblower. Disrupt destructive leadership by speaking out. This requires courage and fortitude. Staff development helps address the problem of destructive leadership because it trains and builds individuals to be better leaders. Addressing psychological factors that make followers susceptible to bad leaders can also be helpful. Followers need to be convinced of their strengths and capabilities. They need to accept uncertainty as natural and necessary, need to value their own sense of self, and need to have the courage to speak out. Followers need to learn to handle ambiguity and live with uncertainty and accept those as natural and necessary. To satisfy our needs to feel special and chosen, we do not need to become compliant with a destructive leader. It is completely legitimate and healthy for followers to want to be part of and accepted as a member of a group or organization, but not at the cost of losing one's sense of who you are as a person. Followers need to muster all the strength available to them to act out against group norms when leaders are leading destructively. In situations where there is destructive leadership, followers need to reach within themselves and find the strength to speak truth to power. So, in other words, Darth Vader's followers need to speak up when his plans are wrong. The Death Star, bad idea. Dumbledore's army needs to organize and, when necessary, confront those in power, even at risk to themselves. Context. To help make sure a destructive leader does not arise, creating a situation that is not hospitable to one helps. So you want to create a system. Look for a system that has checks and balances. When you create a strong system of checks and balances among different organizational units, then the leader shares power with followers and accepts being monitored by followers regarding the use of power. You can also use independent boards of directors. A contextual approach that can act as a deterrent to destructive leadership is to maintain strong oversight of an organization through the use of independent boards of directors that are empowered to have access and input into how the organization is run. And monitor by establishing norms and values. To control for abuse, organizations can attempt to monitor themselves by establishing norms and values that create a strong ethical climate within the organization, and this helps to establish ethical behavior. Here we are, back at our last set of study guide questions. While you grapple with this perhaps disquieting chapter, hopefully a key bit of information that you take away is that it is incumbent upon all of us to work to prevent the rise of destructive leaders. That same feeling that someone else will take care of it or it's someone else's problem is the attitude that allows destructive leaders to rise to power. Remember the famous quotation from Martin Niemöller regarding his opposition to the Nazi rule of Germany in the 1930s and 40s. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. That particular quote is from the Holocaust Encyclopedia, published by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.